Hey guys, I'm going to try to make this video as quick as possible because you guys do have some other assignments to get to. You have the I Have a Dream discussion board that you'll have to look over, as well as a couple of PSAs. Now, as this video goes along, remember, make sure you're answering the questions. I will be looking at those later for accuracy. Now, if it's one of the reflect questions, like I asked you about previous content, you get it wrong, not overly concerned about that, but obviously I want the answers for like the content that I'm going over right now, like the questions over that, to be in line with what we are talking about. Okay, so I will be grading that for accuracy. Okay, now, so this week we are talking, which first off, I miss you guys. I hope you guys had a great Thanksgiving break. Can't wait to see you guys on Thursday. And we will dive into some super exciting stuff on Thursday. But before we get there, we have to lay a little bit of a foundation. Okay, so we're talking about the civil rights movement this week, and I kind of divided this week up into two separate lessons. The lesson that we are viewing, that you are viewing, excuse me, right here and right now, focuses on like civil rights post World War II, late 1940s under Truman into the 1950s under Eisenhower. Next class, we'll really look at like the early 1960s, the March on Washington, all of those things as the civil rights movement gained more of a head of steam in the early 1960s. This is more like looking at the background of, the shortcomings that African Americans faced, the hardships, and those early efforts at pushing forward for an equal society. I really think you guys are going to like the reading over the Trigg integration too, because that's interesting. That's local history that happened right here, right now. And Thursday, we'll actually listen to some quotes from George Radford, talking about his time and his experience with segregation and integration of Trigg County, and you guys will enjoy that. All right, so recall. Okay, I want you to think back way to the beginning of the year, like right after we watched that movie Lincoln, and I want you to think, what was life like for blacks during and after the Reconstruction era? So, in the era after the Civil War, 1865 to 1877, that we call Reconstruction, and then in those years that followed, what was life like for blacks, especially in the South during this time? Go ahead and answer that. Now, I came up with this laundry list. If what you typed in did not match that perfectly, that's okay, because I just kind of did like a stream of consciousness type deal. Okay, well, there's my head. It's floating. All right. So many of you recall, I remember we had that discussion board, like, were African Americans truly free during Reconstruction? And the sources that you guys looked at discussed those black codes, which, were these asinine laws, just ridiculous laws that were attempted to make these freed blacks rely on their former owners. Like, Mississippi had laws that it was illegal for a black man to hunt or fish, even, they could not do any work besides farming. Like, they had to talk to their former master before they did anything. Like, it was these laws that it's like they were free, but they weren't free. All right. So remember those black codes, those ridiculous laws that were passed? And because of the black codes, the 14th Amendment is passed, basically the Equal Protection Clause that's supposed to protect individuals from the actions of the state governments, because obviously the South was passing these black codes. So the 14th Amendment was, in theory, a good idea, but it was not fully effective because, remember, if you recall, the Colfax Massacre and the Supreme Court, they ruled that basically in that instance where scores of blacks were cut down and killed, that the individual citizens, the white citizens who carried that, would not be held responsible because they were not the state. And the 14th Amendment, if you look at the language of it, protects individuals from the actions of the state government, not individuals. So that was turned over to the Louisiana courts, and you know what happened there. Okay. And then, if you recall, right after the Civil War, we see a surge of African Americans elected into public office. But that was short lived because southern states began to realize, even though with the 15th Amendment passed in 1870, that we can't like prevent an African American man from voting, we can impose these literacy tests and these poll tax requirements. And we'll talk about that here in a second. The other thing, segregation was a major part of everyday life, right? And then we'll talk about how that was later rubber stamped by the Supreme Court in 1896. And In the immediate aftermath, I know this is kind of out of order a little bit. This was just a quick like recall, just kind of getting your brain right. Blacks did not have a lot of rights in the South, even with the presence of federal troops. So the second that federal troops were withdrawn from the South in 1877, remember, you had that big election in 1876 that had all the controversy surrounding it. The Republicans get Hayes as president, but what the Democrats got was all of the disputed governor's races in the South were called for the Democrats, and federal troops leave the South for the first time since the Civil War. So there were still some issues happening in the South with the federal troops there, but obviously the conditions are only going to worsen the second those troops leave the South, and that is exactly what happened. Now, the 15th Amendment, we just talked about it, just says the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Basically, saying your right to vote cannot be denied on the color of your skin. However, the 15th Amendment was largely ineffective. So I want you to think for a second, what were some ways that these southern states found ways around the 15th Amendment? How did they still take away the right of African Americans to vote? And here you go. Literacy tests and poll taxes, okay, were both methods they used. You guys remember the literacy test? I do declare, right? And I did that for a little bit of, comic effect, whatever. But I wanted y'all to take that test because this literacy test was the farthest thing from a reading section of the ACT, right? It was a test that was designed to confuse you and easy for me to interpret one way or the other and purposely fail you. Okay, so the South did that. Poll taxes, voters had to pay to vote. Another thing that I forgot to add to this slide, and so you could say all of these things disenfranchised African American voters, was the mere fact of having to register to vote. Okay, I mean that is still a significant hurdle today, is many Americans are not registered to vote, and therefore they never vote. Okay, but the idea of having to register to vote came about during this time period. Um, and the voter registration thing will be a bigger concern when we get to Thursday when we talk about Selma, because that was the reason why Dr. King and his supporters, mainly John Lewis, who we all know was a famous congressman for several years, why they marched they were trying to march from Selma to Birmingham. Or excuse me, from Selma to Montgomery. Is because where Selma was located, most of the African Americans were not even registered to vote. But the 15th Amendment was not effective. Most African Americans did not have the right to vote for the latter half of the 1800s and the first half of the 1900s. We could skip that. You guys know the poll text. Now, Plessy versus Ferguson. So we talked about this a little bit again at the beginning of the year. I want to see if you guys remember what the Supreme Court ruled in this case. So remember, Homer Plessy was an African American man that could pass for a Creole, which was a light skinned person of African descent, that maybe had some French in there. It's Louisiana, okay? But he is arrested. There was a state law in Louisiana segregating rail cards, and Plessy is arrested for sitting in the whites only section of the railroad card. Now, this goes before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court's about to rule on segregation. Now, what did the Supreme Court rule about segregation in this case? And here's what the Supreme Court ruled. Supreme Court ruled in favor of the idea that the facilities could be separate but equal. They said the Constitution only recognizes that these facilities, in order for it to be constitutional, the facilities just had to be equal, and that's it. It didn't matter if they were separated. So the whole separate but equal idea is literally rubber stamped by the Supreme Court with this ruling, and all it did was legalize segregation and Jim Crow laws throughout the entire United States. This picture right here was taken in North Carolina in the 1950s, and it is the epitome of how Plessy versus Ferguson was just an awful ruling. Many historians cite it as one of the worst rulings ever issued by the United States Supreme Court. Now, just look at this picture. How is this a powerful picture? What do you notice? And you look at this picture, okay, these are definitely separate, right? The water fountains are definitely separated. There's one for white and one for African Americans to use, but look at the features of the white one compared to the African American one. And what I think especially makes this powerful is look where the water's coming from the same spot, but it's just going to two different spigots, two different fountains. But these are definitely separate, but definitely not equal. Quick side note, this is in Aurora, okay? If you know where Kinlake's at, this is actually just like right across the road, right across 68 and 80. So if you're at Kinlake, you go right across the road. This was actually a segregated state park that was opened. Around the same time Kinlake opened, the state of Kentucky felt the need to open a park just only for African Americans. And so this shows you, I mean, look, it says open in 1951. This is 70 years ago. So this is a time that is not, that far off. It's not like we're talking about something that was 150 years ago. This was something that some people may have vacationed here. Some of your older grandparents or whatever, might have remembered this. Okay. So, anyway, a little interesting tidbit there to show you how segregation was evident right here in Western Kentucky. Now the new content we're about to go over is content from She, chapter 26, pages 1156 through 1165. So we're not going through too much, okay? And I'll be as quick as I can. So, African Americans in World War II. So, you have the Double V campaign during World War II that Philip Randolph, a prominent African American leader, pushes for. Now, what was the Double V campaign? What was it? Okay, Double V campaign was aka the Double Victory campaign. African Americans push for victory in the war, but they wanted to defeat racial prejudice at home. Now, the Double V campaign was not entirely successful because even though obviously they helped the United States achieve victory in this war, many blacks faced violence and taunts when coming back from the war. They were taken off buses and beat and all kinds of horrendous things. However, though, this is a two-sided sword. There were some of those crazies that were carrying out these atrocious acts. But our main adversary one of our main adversaries during World War II was Germany. The Hitler and the Nazis, who obviously propagated a deep-seated hatred for certain groups of people, notably the Jews. And so our defeat of the Nazis, we villainized the Nazis, and it's like, okay, we got onto them for being prejudiced and judgmental and all that. So maybe we need to dismantle that at home first as well. So there were some violence, but at the same time, there were some in the United States that were like, you know what? We literally fought a war against the Nazis. We need to bring down this hatred and prejudice that we have in the United States at the time. So, like anything else, there were differing opinions on both sides of the aisle. Now, President Truman and civil rights. So Truman is one of those dudes who he had like an awakening almost, because you look at the early testimonies of Truman's life, and he came from a former slave state in Missouri. His grandparents had owned slave. His um parents were believers in the lost cause of the Confederacy. Basically, thinking that the South should have won, basically. And when he was younger, he basically just said essentially white people were better than other people. He said this in a letter to his girlfriend at the time. I mean, that is again something that's a stain on his reputation, but it's there. You can't run away from it. However, he really turned over a new leaf, because if you look at his presidency, he he had several reforms with civil rights. He was really the first president, especially a Democrat, at this time, to step up for civil rights. I mean, because you have to keep in mind, I'm thinking of Teddy Roosevelt in my mind right now. I mean, he was embarrassed to have Booker T. Washington over to the White House. FDR. FDR is a great president. He did a lot of great things, but look at his track record with civil rights. And it's not like Truman's record was sunshine and rainbows, but he did do these positive things. Okay? And this was significant. So Truman became the first president ever to give a speech to the NAACP in 1947. If you do not know what the NAACP stands for, it's National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. But when he gave this speech, it infuriated some people within the Democratic Party. And especially doing this did not help things. So one thing that Truman did was he issued executive orders that ended discrimination in both the federal government and the military. Truman was the first president to integrate the military. Okay, that's what Truman did that was so significant. And he said it was one of the best things that ever happened to the United States, this integration of the military. And when he ran for president in 1948, because obviously he became president in 1945 after FDR's death, so he's running for the first time, he officially made civil rights part of his platform, and he had included this in speeches to Congress and like when he was like accepting the nomination. This led to uh, a break in the Democrat Party. These Southern Democrats, known as Dixiecrats, who were segregationists, who wanted to keep segregation, they obviously did not like this one bit, and some people walked out, okay, of his acceptance speech whenever he was accepting the nomination. However, the Dixiecrats breaking away from Truman actually helped Truman because records of African Americans in the North showed up to support Truman in the 1948 election, and that's ultimately what swept him into office. So, real quick answer before we analyze this quote: what did Truman do that was beneficial in regards to civil rights? Just a recall question. So, answer that. Now, so Truman obviously leaves office amidst mounting pressure from and blowback from the Korean War. You know, the second he fired MacArthur, crap hit the fan really quick with his popularity. His popularity sank like a stone. So he officially says, "I am not running for president," and he steps aside. Now Eisenhower, okay, General Eisenhower, which led the D-Day landing, led Operation Torch North Africa. He's a dude that a lot of Americans know. So he's in this unique position, okay, for being an advocate for civil rights. He has a position of power over the American people. The American people trust him. But look at this. Roy Wilkins, who would eventually become the leader of the NAACP in the 1960s, said this about Eisenhower. He basically said he was a great man, but then he said if he had fought World War II the way he fought for civil rights, we would all be speaking German today. Now, what did Wilkins mean by this quote? And you think about it. What Wilkins meant is that really Eisenhower never really stood up for civil rights. You think back to Eisenhower's military track record, and, Eisenhower, was a tactician. Like, he was brilliant on the battlefield, and he was not afraid to make a move. In this case, what Wilkins is saying is that Eisenhower really didn't stick his neck out for civil rights like he could have. Okay? And a big thing is that Eisenhower underestimated his own potential role or influence. Okay? He did not think that he could change the American people when, in fact, many historians think that, like, with how, from a moral standpoint, like, Americans seem to trust in Eisenhower. They believe that he was right in most cases. He could have had a much bigger influence than what he gave himself credit for. And he also believed that changing the law would not change people's hearts and minds. And if anything, he actually thought that passing these laws, civil rights legislation, would just be like poking the bear in the South, in these former Confederate states, and it would just lead to more chaos and violence toward African Americans. And in some aspects, he was a little right about that. But at the same time, it's like, you are the president, like, you are in a position to execute, like, urge Congress to pass legislation and pass that legislation through, execute that legislation, and implement change. He did not do that. And all in all, he was never a vocal proponent. In fact, we're going to get to Brown versus Board here in a second. Eisenhower told the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court that he wanted them to rule against Brown. He wanted them to rule in favor of racial segregation. And basically, the Chief Justice said, like, I'll do my job and you do yours. Okay, but he was never a vocal proponent for civil rights, even when the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board that racial segregation was unconstitutional. Eisenhower never really rubber stamped it. However, some things did happen with Eisenhower. He did carry out the integration of several public facilities in D.C., so we're talking about parks, a few restaurants, that kind of deal. But his biggest achievement was probably when he sent federal troops to help integrate Little Rock Central High School. Now, whenever he did this, it's not as much a civil right. It was not as much a civil rights stand up for Eisenhower and more of that Eisenhower believed in rule by law. Okay, whenever he sent federal troops to help integrate this high school in Little Rock. So what does this mean? He believed in rule by law, and he believed in the Constitution. Okay, so what does that mean? We'll talk about that in a second, then you'll have a question to answer. Oh, so this Eisenhower thought he made the biggest mistake of his entire life when he appointed Earl Warren as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. However, the Warren Court is by far viewed as one of the most liberal in United States history in bringing positive change. The Warren Court presided over the 50s and the 60s, and you think of all the things that were passed during this time. The school prayer case was passed. That ultimately we didn't get a chance to talk about in this class, preserved religious freedom. Um, Another thing, Miranda rights became a thing in the 1960s because of the Miranda versus Arizona case. That's why, informing criminals of the rights that they have. And then obviously all the civil rights cases that were ruled on during this time. Now, into Brown versus Board, it is viewed as a landmark ruling of the United States Supreme Court, and it was unanimous, 9-0. The Warren Court, Supreme Court justices ruled, and it stated that racially segregated education was unconstitutional, that it went against the Constitution. Now, I went back to this. Actually, no, we're not there yet. Sorry. But the importance of Brown versus Board is it overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. Okay, so on the next slide, be ready to answer. It'll ask you what was the importance of Brown versus Board. What did they rule in Brown versus Board? So what did the Supreme Court rule in Brown versus Board? There you go. And now we're going to talk about Thurgood Marshall. Now, he would eventually become the first African American Supreme Court justice and be on the Warren Court in the 1960s. But Marshall and the NAACP, he had worked as a lawyer for the NAACP, and they had begun to challenge this idea of separate but equal, like years before in the 1930s. And they had made the NAACP had made a little bit of headway in a Supreme Court case in 1950, in which the Supreme Court ruled that a Texas law school that was for blacks was not equal in quality to an all-white law school. And therefore, they ordered the state of Texas to rectify that situation. That was not quite as significant as Brown versus Board, but it was still that first step. Brown versus Board was looking at Plessy versus Ferguson in the eyes and turning it on its head and saying that that is not in line with the Constitution, that is not in line with our founding principles. But interesting thing about Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall graduated from college, and then he wanted to go to law school at the University of Maryland. Okay, they denied him because it was an all-white institution. He was black, so he went to Howard University, which is still a good school. But then you got to think he becomes the he becomes a justice on the Supreme Court and gets to rule on the Constitution. And he's doing this 30 miles from the University of Maryland, where they rejected him just because of the color of his skin. And years later, he is one of 9 justices on the highest court in the United States of America, ruling on civil rights legislation. So, started from the bottom, now he's here. All right, now Marshall made an eloquent argument in Brown versus Board. His biggest thing, he brought in all these experts, and it wasn't just Marshall, it was not a one-man team, but their main reasoning in saying that this was unconstitutional was that it stated that, let's say hypothetically, that both the African American and the white school are perfectly equal. Okay? Even if that was the case, there were still massive ramifications from this. And it's because the court brought in all these sociologists and psychologists, and they proved that just the mere act of segregating people, okay, made the African American kids feel that they were inferior, that they were not good enough. Okay? Just that act of, being like separate and kind of put out on an island, that's mere act of separation was psychologically damaging to those African American children. And so the Supreme Court said that this could not happen for that reason. Okay. So real quick, type in how did psychological findings factor into the Supreme Court's ruling in Brown versus Board? So answer that real quick. Now, How do you think, just pretend like you didn't see that, how do you think the South is going to respond to Brown versus Board? Do you think integration is just going to happen overnight? Hypothesize for a second. What do you think? If you said that the South, it was all sunshine and rainbows and smooth like butter, wrong. Okay. Very, very, very heavy resistance from the South, as almost none of the schools in the South integrated. And this was not just in the immediate aftermath in 1954 when the Supreme Court ruled on this. Your textbook actually mentions in the year 1960, on average, only about 1 out of every 10 school districts in the American South was integrated. And that is 6 years after Brown versus Board ruled that racially segregated education was unconstitutional. And the tactics that some of these schools used was insane. Obviously, if a school employee was for integration, pink slip, they were out the door. The state would literally withhold funding from districts that were trying to integrate. This was a strategy used by several governors, including the governor of Arkansas and the governor of Mississippi. And then some schools would just rather shut their doors than integrate. They would rather shut part of their system down than have blacks and whites in the same school. And if you do not believe me, I present you with Prince Edward County, Virginia. So, Prince Edward County, Virginia, in 1958, decided that they were going to close all their schools down because they were facing pressure from lower courts that they were to integrate. They did not want to do that. So instead, what they decided to do was they were going to close the schools down and then use special grant money to open private schools only for the white students. So this sign that this young lady is holding, it says, "I've lost 4 years of education. Why 5?" This is a reference to the fact that in Prince Edward County, these African Americans did not have a school to go to for 5 years. Now, what you think about that? A lot of you guys are seniors. Imagine if you had to jump from being a 7th grader to a 12th grader. All those years that you missed of education. Or if you're an 11th grader watching this, you were in 6th grade. Now you're a junior in high school. That is huge, that time that was lost. Okay? But this was a reality in parts of the South, unfortunately. Now, because after Brown versus Board, you will have to know this term. Okay? So first off, how did the South, what were some tactics that the South used to try and stop the integration of schools? Type that in. We just covered that. So what were some ways that they tried to halt this integration? Okay. Now, so this is term of this resistance is a more specific term for this is massive resistance. Now, this is not massive retaliation. That's Cold War nukes. We're not talking about that. Massive resistance from the South. So the Southern policymakers, the stakeholders in Congress, they came together, they banded together, and they are trying to make a systematic effort to stem these changes. They do not want them to happen. And they're going through the courts. I mean, they're citing the Constitution. They said that integration was a matter for the state governments, that the 10th Amendment, which reserves that anything that is not stated in the Constitution is reserved to the state governments, are like, oh, we get to decide that. Sound familiar? It should. Now, because the Southern Manifesto happens, okay, and all of these congressmen that are fed up of Brown versus Board come together and state that the Supreme Court had abused its power in the Brown versus Board ruling, that it was a judicial overstep, that the Supreme Court overstepped its bounds in this case. Now, one person, there were 3 congressmen from the South that did not sign the Southern Manifesto. One of those was Lyndon B. Johnson. Now, what do you think for a second? Why would this be significant in later years in the 60s if Johnson did not sign this manifesto? Why? And just take a guess if you don't know. Okay? Johnson would eventually, in the aftermath of John F. Kennedy being assassinated, Lyndon B. Johnson would be the president of the United States. Johnson had aspirations to be the president eventually, and he realized if he wanted to make a longer political career, he had to earn the African American vote and African American support. And so he knew he could not go against it. And also, Johnson did not agree with his Southern counterparts on a lot of things on this matter. Oh, I thought I lost it for a second. Woo, that was scary. All right. Now, so we've talked all about the integration, and it looks like we don't have too much more to go. We just have to talk about Little Rock, and then we have to talk about the Montgomery bus boycott. Okay. So, Chaos in Little Rock. So, they start to integrate in Arkansas, and there were 9 African American students that were handpicked, okay, to be admitted to Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. Now, I always ask my class this when we're in session, so I'm going to ask you this now. Imagine you are in charge of picking the 9 African American students that are going to integrate this high school in the South. It's a hostile situation, okay? Obviously, tempers are flaring over the issue of integration. What kind of characteristics would you want these students to have? These 9 students, what kind of characteristics would you want these students to have? Now, the way these students were picked, obviously they were good students. They had good grades. But another thing was they were tested to be resilient. In the face of adversity and all that they were going to go through in this hostile situation, they were chosen because they had the courage to not do anything when they were provoked. Their first day, they try to get admitted. Okay, these 9 students. I mean, y'all know how high school is stressful enough as it is. The governor of Arkansas. Okay, so the federal court order was supposed to integrate the school. He calls in the Arkansas National Guard. Oh, and were they there to protect the students? Wrong. The Arkansas National Guard was sent to prevent the students from entering the school. The students had to turn around, and they were walking back, and they were attacked by a white mob. Now, the mayor of Little Rock gets on the horn, and he calls up Eisenhower. He's like, man, you got to do something about this. And so Eisenhower decides to send federal troops in to enforce this desegregation, this integration. And the reason this is significant, this is the first time since Reconstruction. So I told you this video would all connect back together. The first time since Reconstruction, which we talked about at the very beginning of this year, that federal troops were sent to the South to protect the blacks. You're talking about a time span of 80 years. 80 years. Now, Eisenhower, as you recall, okay, I'm not saying he didn't want to help in this situation, but Eisenhower sent troops more in this case because he was a big believer in the Constitution and rule by law. Okay, now, what factor would that have in him sending troops in this situation? He really believed in the Constitution and rule by law. Why would he send troops in this case? And the answer is that the Supreme Court had ruled on segregation in schools. They had said it was unconstitutional and that schools needed to be integrated. Eisenhower believed in rule by law and law and order. And obviously what was happening in Arkansas was not rule by law. It was mob rule. And so he sent troops to the South, to restore the order and keep the peace. And obviously protect the prestige of the United States Supreme Court. If the United States Supreme Court is truly the final interpreter of the Constitution, then Eisenhower cannot have a governor, the chief executive officer of a state, purposely defying an order by the United States Supreme Court and a ruling by the United States Supreme Court. So that is why Eisenhower sent troops to the South, and that's the connection with his strong convictions with rule by law and the Constitution. Now, this is kind of funny. Well, not really, but these lovely individuals, look what signs they're holding in protesting the integration of Little Rock. Race mixing is communism. Stop mixing the race of the anarchists. Race mixing is communism. All of these great quotes. Now, in history, we often look at events unrelated. We don't really make the connections, connect the dots, but there is a definite connecting of the dots to be made here. The integration of Little Rock happened in 1957. Why would these segregationists, these people, why would they make this argument that race mixing is communism? Exactly. They are trying to capitalize on the Red Scare still. Now, McCarthyism has died down a little bit. In fact, McCarthy himself has bit the dust at this point due to alcoholism, but this is still a prevalent part of the 1950s. It's a Cold War. So just the mere accusation of saying, if you're for mixing people together, that you're a communist, it's going to maybe dissuade some of those people who are on the fence, so to speak, because nobody wants to be accused of being a communist. Right. All right, moving on. So ultimately, the troops are sent. They help keep the peace. Little Rock 9, that's the 9 students. Now, last thing for the day, Montgomery bus boycott. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. You guys know the story. Okay? So Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white person, was arrested. The bus driver told her, hey, you know the law, you have to move. And Rosa Parks was like, nope, I'm not getting up. Now, the African Americans in Montgomery, okay, start to boycott the bus system. Okay? Which, what does boycott mean? I know that's like something you probably learned in like 6th grade economics, but just to clarify, what does boycott mean? Exactly. They are not going to buy this good, or they are not going to use this service, in this case, the bus, because they're making a political stand. And why this boycott was potentially going to have such a large impact is that um because most of the customers of the bus system were African Americans. Okay. And so Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. We all know Rosa Parks. However, we're going to talk real quick about Joanne Robinson and Claudette Colvin. Now, Joanne Robinson was an English professor was, man, that's bad, making a grammatical error when talking about an English professor, was a English professor at Alabama State College. As soon as she heard of Rosa Parks' arrest, she sent pamphlets all over Montgomery telling people what had happened and how they needed to boycott. She is not given enough credit for this, because obviously this is like Rosa Parks was the initial flame. This was the gasoline, spreading the word and getting everybody all fired up and ready to go. Now, Claudette Colvin, some of you guys may have heard of her. She was not the first person to give up her seat on the bus, but it's significant because 9 months before Rosa Parks gave up hers, Colvin refused to give up hers. However, you don't hear about Claudette Colvin enough because the NAACP did not push for her to be the spokesperson. Why? She was 15 and pregnant at the time. And the NAACP wanted to wait around for a better, person to be like that face of the movement. But obviously, she did the same thing that Rosa Parks did, and in this case, Joanne Robinson distributed these pamphlets. Don't ride the bus to work, to town, to school, any place, Monday, December 5th. Another, which is weird because literally that's next week. Another Negro woman has been arrested and put in jail because she refused to give up her bus seat. Don't ride the bus to work, to town, to school, or anywhere on Monday. If you work, take a cab or share a ride or walk. And this picture speaks for itself. All the people who walked to work, miles and miles and miles, all because they were not going to give in with this boycott. What made the Montgomery bus boycott, sorry, I'm looking at my notes, making sure we just got a couple slides left. What made the Montgomery bus boycott unique was that there was no wavering from the African Americans who were protesting. There had been boycotts before, like a couple years before in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, a bunch of African Americans had done a boycott. They had kind of had a middle of the road compromise with the white leaders in that city, and it's like they were given a little bit more leeway, but they still weren't fully given their full civil rights like they deserved. African Americans, honestly, when they started this boycott, they might have been looking for that. But here's the thing: the white leaders in Montgomery, they did not wave an inch. They did not give in 1 inch, you know? And so what that actually did in a weird way was it opened the door for them to have total civil rights out of this, or at least in regards to the buses. And that's exactly what happened, because ultimately what the Supreme Court ruled was that Montgomery's buses had to be desegregated. And so, the boycott worked. And what was significant about the boycott is it showed the power of nonviolent civil disobedience. Okay. Which is, breaking the law on purpose, an unjust law, but not being violent while you do it. And that's what the boycott was. I mean, they just weren't riding the bus, which, I mean, I guess, sorry, I misspoke. The boycott itself was not nonviolent civil disobedience, but what Rosa Parks did that started it was. And, you have Martin Luther King Jr., who's 26 years old at the time, who's the main organizer of this boycott. He is really, like, not really that well known before this. Now, all of a sudden, like, he's making national headlines. In the African American community, he begins to be seen as a leader. And it's because of the success of this boycott. So, what was the outcome of the Montgomery bus boycott, and how did it impact Martin Luther King's status in society? Answer that. All right. So, when I return on Thursday, sorry, under construction, the rest of the slides are not there. Okay, when I return on Thursday, we will look at She chapter 27, pages 1196 through 1213. We will be discussing the integration of Trigg County High School. That is not in your textbook, but it is in the reading I assigned to you to do. Okay. And we will also be talking about the integration of Alabama and the University of Alabama, Mississippi. We'll be talking about Birmingham, the I Have a Dream speech, the Selma March, Malcolm X. Full agenda on Thursday. And I can't wait to see you guys. If you have any questions, you let me know. Make sure you do your I Have a Dream discussion board and your PSA. Have a great rest of your day.